Hello everybody and welcome to Parks Bros. It's Drew here, and today we're heading all the way to Mason, Ohio for our full in-depth review. Kings Island's own Banshee. This B&M inverted coaster opened on April 18th, 2014 at Kings Island in Mason, Ohio. And at the time of its opening, it was one of the tallest, fastest, and longest inverted coasters in the entirety of the world. To achieve some of those metrics, it has a top height of 167 feet with a 150-foot drop, getting you up to a speed of 68 miles an hour. While going that speed, you'll traverse all 4,124 feet of track in a full duration of 2 minutes and 40 seconds. This terrifying coaster also features 7 different inversions, including a dive loop, a vertical loop, a zero-G roll, a rare pretzel knot, another vertical loop, and to finish it all off, an inline twist. With that all covered, I think it's time to find out how to get there. To arrive at Banshee's gates, the quickest way to get there is entering through the front entrance, of course, and then immediately taking a left, past the main theater at the park and past the Chicken Shack restaurant, as well as Delirium on the right-hand side. You'll obviously see Banshee at this point. Just keep going forward until you see that wonderful-looking sign, and the entry will be just to the right of it. Once you enter in, you'll be greeted by a cemetery. That's right, there's a bunch of tombstones, including a big old shrine to the old ride that used to be in that area, Son of Beast, which I think is a really cool detail. From there, after wandering through the graveyard, you'll find yourself in some semi-shaded switchbacks before heading up into the station, which looks like an old abandoned chapel. From there, you're ready to sit down, as this covered station building invites you into more of a creepy theme. Banshee's seats are quite different from many other B&M inverted coasters that you've probably ridden, such as Raptor at Cedar Point, or the Batman clones at parks such as Six Flags Magic Mountain or Six Flags Over Georgia. Or heck, for some of my Southern California natives, Silver Bullet at Knott's Berry Farm. These restraints are more akin to flying coasters such as Tatsu at Six Flags Magic Mountain or Manta at SeaWorld Orlando, and wing coasters as well, such as Thunderbird at Holiday World and Gatekeeper at Cedar Point. So once you take a seat in that quite deep seat that kind of leans you back just a tiny bit, trying to ensure your feet don't touch the ground, you'll pull the restraint from over your head and you'll notice that it is a full vest styled restraint with a big old lap bar at the very bottom, sitting right on top of your hips. Coming out from that lap bar will be 2 handlebars that you can firmly grasp as you get whipped through all 7 terrifying inversions. But I will say, just because of how forceful this ride can get, be prepared for this restraint to get possibly quite tight on either your collarbones or even your hips. This is a fairly common complaint about these restraints as they get tighter and tighter throughout the ride, but once you have that restraint down, make sure to buckle up with the seatbelt buckle that'll be coming up in between your legs, and before you know it, you're going to be heading out of that chapel and taking on the dreaded Banshee. Good luck. As your journey begins, you'll take a slow turn to the left and then head up that giant lift hill, specifically all 167 feet of it. It's almost 200 feet tall. As you start climbing, you'll climb fairly slow until you get to the very, very top, getting a wonderful view of the park and all of the surrounding foliage. But that's not the only crazy thing at the top. There's even a bit of theming, as you'll hear the horrifying screech of the Banshee just before you start heading down this twisted drop. Unlike many other B&M inverted coasters, there's no little pre-drop section before you start plummeting towards the ground. With Banshee, you're already going towards the ground before you know it. And honestly, it looks and feels almost beyond vertical with how steep this first drop is. It's a total highlight and a great way to start off the ride, as it looks like you're skydiving face first into the ground. At the final second though, you'll start to go upwards into this first inversion, the dive loop to the left, and you'll experience your first major moment of positive G-forces pushing you down into your seat. This is going to be a reoccurring factor on this entire ride. Heading into this dive loop, you'll find yourself upside down and potentially getting a little teensy bit of floating hang time up top before you start twisting down toward the ground again and pulling out in some crazy positive G's yet again, even more forceful than after the first drop. At the bottom of this valley though, the camera will be on your right hand side, so make sure you're making your craziest Banshee face at that point before you're again vaulted into the signature vertical loop that again pulls some crazy positive G-forces throughout. This is one of few roller coasters in the entirety of the world though that features a cool moment on their vertical loop. That's because it completely wraps around the lift hill, adding in a really cool photogenic moment for people off-ride and potentially a little bit of trickery with the eyes on-ride. Again, you'll go back towards the ground and experience more positive G's. I will say this is one of those spots on the ride that I did feel a little bit of roughness, at least when I was sitting towards the back of the train, specifically in the very back row in row 8. But of course, right after that little bit of shakiness, you go up into one of my favorite moments of the ride, this ginormous 0G roll that is unlike any other that I've experienced thus far. It not only gives you that cool 0G feeling, it gives some pretty crazy lateral forces and even a little bit of airtime, if you will. The way it's shaped is just fairly interesting, as it resembles a big floater airtime hill that they just put a twist in the middle of. It does give you a little bit of a breather though from those positive G's before you again start heading upward into one of the most famous moments on the entire ride, the pretzel knot. This element starts out like a dive loop but ends with a sidewinder, meaning you'll go upside down in a corkscrew-like fashion before finishing out the element in a vertical loop, if that makes sense. If you played Roller Coaster Tycoon, I'm sure it does. And following that, you do another half loop upward with just an insane amount of elongated positive G-forces just pressing you down into that seat more and more as it goes along before twisting out in another corkscrew-like element. Although this time, it doesn't go far off to the side. It twists underneath the pieces of track that you just traversed, technically in more of an Immelmann's form, if you know what that element is. Realistically, it's a half loop into an inline twist of sorts. Regardless though, this moment is just ridiculously intense all the way through. I will say that intensity does bring in a little bit of roughness, at least in the back rows from my experience, as there's just a little bit of bump and shake through a lot of those positive G moments. Thankfully though, in the very front, this ride is a heck of a lot more graceful, so if you're not into the more intense ride, definitely go up front. Following that pretzel knot is another fairly forceful vertical loop, but you can definitely tell you're starting to lose a tiny bit of steam, but that's completely okay. You need the break at this point. That break doesn't last long, however, as you're about to experience probably the most intense second of positive G's on the entire ride as you twist and get vaulted upwards into this crazy upward helix that honestly seems way too small for the speed that you're moving at. I remember my head getting pushed forward every time we went through it just because that moment is so impactful. But man, oh man, it was one of my favorite moments of the ride, especially with what came right after that inline twist, which gives you some crazy amounts of hang time, aka pushing you outward of your seat while you're upside down. This moment of the ride is oddly tranquil, but still intense in its own unique way. Again, though, it worked perfectly as a little bit of break time before you head into the actual brake run itself. Speaking of which, you'll then go into a downward helix, getting a little bit more more positive G-forces before twisting to the right in a more Raptor-esque lateral turn into the final brakes. From this point, you'll start to slowly run into the station again, grab your belongings from the lockers that are actually outside of the ride itself after you've head down the stairs of the exit and through its cool looking gift shop. But with that, you've officially taken on Banshee. Did you love it? Did you not like it? It's certainly not for everyone. Now that we've finished taking on Banshee, it's time for my full thoughts and ratings. So, Banshee, oh my goodness, one of Kings Island's best, at least in my humble opinion. If you disagree, that's completely okay. I know a common complaint about this ride is mainly the restraint, as well as a little bit of that rattling, that shuffling back and forth that the train will experience throughout the ride. Now, to be completely honest, I think both of those complaints are a little overblown, at least in my experience on the roller coaster, but I can see how certain riders might have a more uncomfortable experience because of those factors. Moving on from that, though, I have to talk about how much I really enjoy this ride, as well as its color scheme, logo, layout, theming, everything about all of the aesthetic touches to the ride is just brilliant. It is one of the best looking coasters out there, especially when it's surrounded by the forest like it is. And man, that sign is just the cherry on top. You can hear that screech from the top of the lift hill halfway throughout the park, so you definitely know it's one of the more menacing rides throughout Kings Island, which I think is a cool touch, because in all honesty, it is probably the most intense roller coaster, at least intense steel roller coaster at the park for sure. Every single element is huge, fast, and filled with positive G-forces. As I was even thinking on ride itself, man, this thing is intimidating, especially on a back row night ride. Oh my goodness. That was probably one of the most intense experiences I can think of on any roller coaster to date, especially traveling into the near pitch dark once you get out to that pretzel knot element. There's some cool lighting up front though, thankfully, but of course that'll disorient you later as your eyes adjusted to the light, and so everything is a little bit darker once you get out into the middle of nowhere. But this ride's layout is really fantastic if you ask me. Every element really hits very well, with maybe the exception of that second vertical loop. I think they might have done something different there, but at the same time, it is one of those breather moments during the ride, even though it's still giving some pretty crazy positive G's. With that said though, Banshee is definitely not for the faint of heart, but man, for the right people, it can be one of the best rides out there. And I gotta be honest, this wasn't high on my list of must-dos at the park, but after riding it quite a few times, man, I can't wait to go back and ride it. Now I think it's time for some favorites and least favorites, as we'll start with the least favorites. In terms of seats, probably somewhere in row 4 or 5, perfectly in the middle of the train. I feel like you might be able to get the best of both worlds, but man, those two worlds are pretty standout on their own. As the front row gives you this crazy, graceful, wind in your face experience, almost like you are the Banshee, which I think is a cool way to look at it. Whereas man, that back row, whew, it's like you're getting chased by it. The intensity ramps up, that gracefulness goes down, and the roughness bumps up just a teeny bit. But those are definitely going to have to split my favorites, front and back row respectively. Just fantastic places to sit on the ride. Now, in terms of elements, I think my least favorite moment on the ride is that second vertical loop. I think that's pretty obvious at this point, but my favorite is going to be a lot tougher to choose. And it might be a little controversial. I love that moment of the upward helix right after that vertical loop into the inline twist. That is just a fantastic way to flow through a layout, as it completely disorients you, especially in comparison to the rest of what you've experienced thus far. It throws you a curveball 3/4 of the way through the layout, and I absolutely adore that about it. Now that we've got all that tied up into a bow, I think it's time to move on to my official ratings. If you have not seen one of these full in-depth reviews in the past, just know I have a little bit of an unorthodox orthodox rating system. First, I'm going to recommend how experienced of a coaster rider you should be before taking on said ride. I'll give an intensity rating out of 5 stars as well as a fun rating out of 5 stars, and then wrap it all up with a personal rating out of 10. So first of all, I gotta say, this is at least for experienced coaster riders, if not for very experienced coaster riders. This thing can get really, really intense, especially in back row night rides. It can truly be another beast. Well, not like the one across the park. We'll get to that one soon. While not the tallest or fastest in the park, not by a long shot, I would actually recommend riding something like Diamondback or Orion before checking out Banshee, and heck, even maybe in Vertigo or Flight of Fear, especially if you're not used to those positive G-forces on inversions, because that's really this whole ride. Moving on to stars for intensity, I'm at least gonna give it a 4-star rating. I might even bump up to 5 on certain rides. I guess what I'll officially say is 4.5 stars, why not? It is pretty easily the most intense inverted coaster I've been on thus far, with the 12 or 13 that I've been on. But that'll move us into the fun category. I'll be honest, this thing is not exactly meant to be fun necessarily, more scary, just like the theme would suggest, as I'll give it a 3-star rating out of 5. It has its fun moments, it can be fun for the right people, but this ride definitely wants to throw you around. So that'll lead into my personal score out of 10. This is a pretty easy 9 for me. I think it's an absolutely amazing ride experience, especially if you like some pretty awesome inversions, and it's pretty easily one of my favorite rides at all of Kings Island and all of Ohio. Now, whether or not it's my favorite inverted coaster, you're gonna have to wait until the end of the year to find that out, but it is a pretty spectacular example of what they can do with that type of model. With that said though, I'm curious, what do you guys think of Banshee? Do you love it? Do you not? Let me know down in the comments below, and of course while you're down there, make sure to check out the description for all of those links, including a link that will help us all rank the rides of Kings Island. So make sure to go check out that poll down below so you can help us out, and so we can find out what's the most beloved and not much beloved rides at this wonderful park. Speaking of Kings Island though, we're gonna have more reviews from there in the very near future, so make sure to subscribe for those if you enjoyed this. But of course, until next time, we'll see you on the next ride.